1943. A German soldier captured in North Africa expected torture, starvation, maybe execution. That's what the Reich had promised would happen if the Americans took him alive. Instead, on his first morning as a POW in Alabama, guards served him bacon, scrambled eggs, real coffee with cream, and butter on white bread. More food than his entire family back in Stuttgart had seen in months. What he discovered next about American abundance didn't just shock him, it shattered everything the Nazi propaganda machine had told him about the war. But would this unexpected mercy actually change the mind of a man trained to see Americans as the enemy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In 1943, the world was split by war, and nowhere felt that divide more than Germany. The Third Reich had been fighting for 4 years, and what started with victory parades had turned into something darker and harder. Cities that once glowed with streetlights now went black every night, waiting for the bombers to come. The sound of air raid sirens had become as common as church bells once were. In homes across Stuttgart and Berlin and Hamburg, families gathered around radios to hear Joseph Goebbels tell them they were still winning, that final victory was just around the corner, that the enemy was weak and desperate. But their stomachs told a different story. By 1943, a German mother with a ration card could get bread maybe twice a week if she was lucky. Meat came once a month, and even then it was often just bones with scraps clinging to them. Real coffee had disappeared 2 years earlier, replaced by a bitter brown liquid made from roasted acorns that nobody could pretend tasted right. Children forgot what chocolate looked like. Butter became a memory. People started eating things they never thought they would eat, and they started looking thin in a way that made their eyes seem too big for their faces. The factories that still stood kept running, but barely, because Allied bombs had torn apart the rail lines that brought coal and steel. Everything was breaking down, slowly and then quickly, like a machine that had run too long without oil. Hans Müller knew this world. He was 24 years old, born and raised in Stuttgart, where his father had worked in a machine factory until the bombs turned it into twisted metal and dust. Hans had been drafted in 1941 when he was just 22, pulled from his apprenticeship as an electrician and given a rifle and a uniform that never quite fit right. They sent him to North Africa, where the sand got into everything and the sun cooked men inside their tanks. He fought because that was what you did, because everyone else was fighting, because the alternative was a firing squad or a labor camp. He believed in duty even if he had stopped believing in much else. Then, in 1943, after the disaster at El Alamein, everything fell apart. The British came from one side and the Americans from another, and suddenly Hans was sitting in the desert with his hands on his head while a soldier from Texas pointed a gun at his chest. That was how Hans became a prisoner of war. They loaded him onto a truck with 40 other men, all of them silent, all of them thinking about what came next. The propaganda had been very clear about what Americans did to prisoners. Torture, they said, slave labor in mines where you would never see daylight again, execution, maybe if you were lucky enough to die quickly. The ship ride across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. Hans spent most of it crammed in a hold below deck with 200 other prisoners, all of them seasick, all of them scared in ways they would never say out loud. At night, in whispers, men shared the rumors. Someone had heard that Americans worked prisoners to death building railroads. Someone else said they threw you in a hole in the ground and forgot about you. Nobody knew for sure, and not knowing made it worse. When Hans finally stumbled onto the deck and saw the American coastline, he felt no relief, just dread. They put the prisoners on a train heading south. Hans pressed his face against the window and could not believe what he was seeing. The cities were whole. Not just standing, but lit up, with cars moving through streets that had no bomb craters, past buildings that had all their windows. There were so many cars. In Germany, gasoline was so rare that even military vehicles sat idle half the time. Here, civilians drove around like fuel cost nothing. Hans saw factories with smoke rising from their stacks, which meant they were running, which meant they had power and coal and workers. He saw farms with painted barns and fat cattle. Everything looked impossibly clean and impossibly rich, and Hans felt something twist in his stomach that might have been anger or might have been despair. The train pulled into a camp somewhere in Alabama. Hans did not know where Alabama was, only that it was hot and humid in a way that made his uniform stick to his skin. The camp had barbed wire and guard towers, which felt familiar and almost comforting, because at least he understood those things. Guards with rifles walked them through gates. They were told to line up. They were told to be quiet. Hans waited for the beating to start, for someone to scream at them or hit them or make an example of somebody. It did not happen. The guards looked bored more than anything, and some of them were smoking cigarettes like this was just another day at a boring job. That first night, Hans lay on a cot in a barracks with thin walls and tried to sleep. He could not. Every sound made him jump. He kept waiting for the door to crash open and for whatever was coming to finally arrive. It never did. Eventually, the exhaustion pulled him under. Morning came with a bell. The prisoners stumbled out of their bunks, confused and nervous. Guards told them to line up. They marched toward a large building, and as they got closer, Hans smelled something that made no sense. Bacon. Real bacon, frying. And coffee. Actual coffee, not the acorn mud they drank back home. And something else, something sweet like bread baking. The smell was so strong it made Hans dizzy. They walked into the mess hall, and Hans stopped moving. Long tables were set with trays. On every tray sat bacon strips, scrambled eggs that were still steaming, white bread with yellow butter melting into it, and a cup of coffee that was dark and rich. There was orange juice in glass pitchers. There was milk. Hans stared at his tray like it might explode. This was more food than his mother had seen in a month. This was more food that he had eaten in a week, maybe 2 weeks. He sat down slowly. Around him, other prisoners were doing the same, all of them silent, all of them staring. Someone whispered that it must be a trick, that they were being fattened up before something terrible. Hans picked up his fork. His hand was shaking. He took a bite of eggs, and they tasted like eggs, real eggs with salt and pepper. He took a bite of bacon, and the fat melted on his tongue. He drank the coffee, and it was hot and bitter and perfect. No one came to take it away. No one hit him. No one said it was a joke. Hans ate every bite on his tray, and when he was done, he put his head in his hands and tried very hard not to cry. The food did not stop. That was the part Hans couldn't wrap his mind around. Every single day, 3 times a day, the mess hall served meals that would have fed a German family for a week. Lunch was roast beef sandwiches on soft white bread with lettuce and tomatoes that were actually red and ripe, not the pale, sad things he remembered from home. There was milk to drink, cold milk in glass bottles, and apples that were shiny and crisp. Dinner brought fried chicken with skin so golden it crackled when you bit into it. Mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans that still had flavor, and slices of pie for dessert. Apple pie, cherry pie, pie like Hans had only seen in pictures. He started keeping count in his head, adding up what each meal would cost on the black market back in Stuttgart. The numbers got so high they stopped meaning anything. One breakfast here equaled a month of his mother's ration cards. One dinner equaled what a factory worker made in a week if he sold everything he owned. Hans thought about writing home to tell someone, but he knew they would never believe him. They would think he had lost his mind or was making up stories to feel better about being captured. 2 weeks into his time at the camp, something happened that broke several of the prisoners completely. It was a Sunday, and Sundays were always a little different because the guards seemed more relaxed and there was less work to do. After lunch, the mess hall doors opened again, even though it was not dinner time. The prisoners filed in, confused, and found bowls waiting at each seat. Inside each bowl were 3 scoops of ice cream. Vanilla ice cream, pale and smooth and already starting to melt in the Alabama heat. Hans had never tasted ice cream in his entire life. Ice was something you chipped off frozen rivers in winter, not something you put in food. He picked up his spoon and took a bite, and the cold sweetness filled his mouth in a way that made his teeth ache and his eyes water. Around him, grown men were crying into their bowls. Not loud sobbing, just quiet tears running down faces while they ate. One man, a sergeant from Bavaria who had fought in 3 campaigns, put his spoon down and walked outside because he could not handle it anymore. Hans understood. The ice cream was not just ice cream. It was proof of something they did not want to face yet. After 2 weeks of eating, the prisoners were assigned to work details. The Geneva Convention said prisoners had to work, but it also said they had to be paid and treated fairly. Hans and 20 other men were sent to a farm about 5 miles from the camp. They rode there in a truck with 2 guards who smoked cigarettes and talked about a baseball game like the prisoners were not even there. At the farm, they picked vegetables and loaded them into crates. It was hot work, but it was not hard work, not like the labor camps Hans had heard about. At noon, the farmer's wife brought out sandwiches and lemonade. Lemonade! Made from real lemons and real sugar. She smiled at them when she handed out the food. Hans did not know what to do with that smile. At the end of the day, each prisoner was given a small slip of paper that said 80 cents. Camp scrip, they called it. You could use it at the camp canteen to buy things. Hans did not believe the canteen would have anything worth buying until he walked inside and saw the shelves. There were Coca-Cola bottles lined up in rows, their glass sides sweating cold. There were Hershey chocolate bars in brown wrappers. There were cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, and Camels, more cigarettes than Hans had seen in one place since before the war. There were razor blades and soap that smelled like flowers and toothpaste in metal tubes. There was candy he did not recognize, and magazines with colored pictures, and playing cards, and chewing gum. Hans bought a Coca-Cola because he had never had one, and everyone talked about them. He paid his 10 cents in scrip and took the cold bottle outside. When he opened it, the fizz rushed up and almost spilled over. He took a sip, and the bubbles burned his throat in a pleasant way, and the taste was sweet and sharp and completely unlike anything he had ever drunk. He sat on a bench and drank it slowly, making it last, and thought about his younger sister back home, who was 14 and had probably forgotten what candy tasted like. He thought about how American prisoners of war had more luxury than German civilians who had done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong country at the wrong time. The next week, Hans was assigned to a work detail at a cannery in town. They needed extra hands to process vegetables, and the prisoners were cheap labor, even at 80 cents a day. The cannery was nothing like the factories Hans knew in Germany. It was bright inside with electric lights everywhere. The floors were clean concrete, not dirt or oil-stained wood. There were machines that did most of the work, conveyor belts that moved cans from one station to another, and women in white aprons who operated the equipment. The women wore lipstick, their hair was curled, they looked healthy and well-fed, and they worked 8-hour shifts, not the 12 or 14-hour days Hans remembered from German factories. During a break, a truck pulled up outside. It was painted bright red with white letters that said Coca-Cola in script so perfectly it looked like art. The back of the truck was refrigerated, which seemed impossible, but Hans watched them open it and cold air poured out like fog. Inside were hundreds of bottles, all of them ice cold, ready to be delivered to stores and restaurants and whoever wanted them. A worker, a man about 40 with gray hair, grabbed a bottle and tossed it to Hans without warning. Hans caught it clumsily. The man grinned and said something in English. Hans did not understand all of it, but he caught the word thirsty. The man made a drinking motion. Hans opened the bottle and drank, and it was even colder than the first one he had bought, so cold it made his head hurt for a second. The man laughed and waved and went back to unloading his truck full of cold soda in the middle of a war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That night, Hans lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Other prisoners were talking quietly in the dark. Some of them still insisted this was all propaganda, that the Americans were trying to trick them, that any day now the real treatment would start. But Hans was starting to think differently. He was starting to think that maybe this was not a trick. Maybe this was just how Americans lived. Maybe they had so much that feeding prisoners well cost them nothing. Maybe they had so much that they could afford to be kind. On Thursday afternoon, a bus arrived at the camp. It was not a military vehicle, but a regular civilian bus, yellow and clean. Out stepped a group of people from a local church, mostly older women in nice dresses and a few men in suits. They carried boxes of books and set up tables in the recreation hall. Hans wandered over with some other prisoners, curious and cautious. The church people were teaching English to anyone who wanted to learn. They had brought primers and picture books and dictionaries. An older woman with white hair and glasses sat down across from Hans. Her name was Mrs. Henderson, and she spoke slowly and clearly. She asked him his name and where he was from. She asked if he had a family. When Hans said his mother was in Stuttgart, Mrs. Henderson's face got soft and sad. She said, in careful German that was not very good, that she would pray for his mother's safety. Hans stared at her. He waited for the insult or the trick. It did not come. She just patted his hand and opened a book to start teaching him English words. Hans walked back to his barracks that evening with a small English primer under his arm and a feeling in his chest he could not name. That night, he started a letter home, but stopped after the first line because he did not know how to explain any of this. How could he tell his mother that the enemy fed him better than the fatherland ever had? How could he tell her that an American grandmother prayed for her safety when German propaganda said Americans wanted all Germans dead? He folded the paper and put it under his pillow. In the barracks after lights out, Friedrich, a true believer who still wore his iron cross even in prison, whispered that they should not be fooled. He said this was all a show, that the real America was weak and falling apart, that the Führer would still win. Hans said nothing, but he thought about the Coca-Cola truck and the ice cream and Mrs. Henderson's kind eyes. He thought about how none of this looked like weakness. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the questions kept him awake until dawn. November came to Alabama with cooler air that felt good after months of heat that made everything sticky. The trees started changing colors, and the guards seemed almost happy about something. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the camp commander stood up in the mess hall and made an announcement. Thursday was an American holiday called Thanksgiving, he said, and there would be a special meal. Hans had learned enough English by now to understand most of it. He glanced at the other prisoners. A special meal seemed impossible because every meal was already special compared to what they had left behind. Thursday arrived cold and clear. The prisoners were told to clean up and put on their best clothes, which just meant the least dirty uniforms they had. They lined up outside the mess hall at noon instead of the usual 5 o'clock dinner time. When the doors opened, Hans smelled something that made his knees weak. Roasted meat, but different from the usual chicken or beef. Richer somehow, sweeter. The prisoners filed inside and stopped in their tracks. Every table had whole roasted turkeys on them. Not one turkey for the whole camp, but multiple turkeys, golden brown with crispy skin, so big they took up entire platters. Around the turkeys sat bowls and dishes of food Hans had never seen before. Red sauce that looked like jam. Bread cubes mixed with herbs and vegetables. 3 different kinds of potatoes, mashed and roasted, and something orange that someone said was made from sweet potatoes. Green beans in a cream sauce with crispy onions on top. Corn. Rolls that were still warm with steam coming off them when you broke them open. Butter in yellow blocks. And at the end of each table, pies. Pumpkin pies and apple pies with lattice crusts, and bowls of whipped cream so white and fluffy they looked like clouds. Hans sat down in front of this feast and could not move. His fork felt heavy in his hand. Around him, prisoners were serving themselves, piling food onto their plates until the plates could not hold anymore. Someone passed him a platter with turkey, and Hans took a slice. Then another. Then stuffing. Then potatoes. His plate disappeared under the food. He picked up his fork again and just stared at everything in front of him. In his mind, he saw his mother's kitchen in Stuttgart. He saw her thin hands trying to make soup from a single potato and some wilted cabbage leaves. He saw his little sister's face, all cheekbones and big eyes, asking if there would be meat on Sunday. He saw his father before the bombs, coming home from the factory with shoulders bent from 12-hour shifts, grateful for black bread and margarine. He saw ration cards and empty shelves and people fighting over scraps in the market. And here he sat, a prisoner, an enemy, eating like royalty. Something broke inside Hans at that moment. Not loudly, not with tears or shouting, just a quiet cracking feeling, like ice on a pond when the weather starts to warm. He put his fork down and pressed his hands against his eyes. The propaganda had told them America was weak, dying, on the edge of collapse. That Americans were soft and could not fight, could not produce, could not survive a real war. That Germany fought for survival, for living space, for the future of their children. But Hans sat here in an enemy prison camp, eating food his family could not imagine while his country starved. If this was a weakness, what did that make Germany? If this collapsed, what was happening back home? He picked up his fork again and ate slowly. The turkey was moist and flavored with herbs. The stuffing was rich with butter and sage. The sweet potatoes had brown sugar and cinnamon. Every bite tasted like a lie he had been told was falling apart. After the meal, guards walked around handing out cigars and cigarettes to anyone who wanted them. Real tobacco. Hans took a cigarette even though he rarely smoked. He went outside and lit it and stood in the November sun and tried to make sense of anything. Friedrich found him there an hour later. Friedrich still believed. He said this was all propaganda, that the Americans were showing off, that this did not mean anything. Hans turned to him and spoke quietly so the guards would not hear. He said they were already captured. The war was already lost. What was the point of showing off to men who could not do anything about it? Friedrich said the Führer had promised final victory, that new weapons were coming, that everything would turn around. Hans looked at Friedrich's face and saw something desperate there, something that needed to be believed because the alternative was too horrible. Hans said he had been thinking. He said the Führer promised they would take Moscow in 6 weeks. That did not happen. The Führer said Stalingrad would never fall. It did. The Führer said many things, and Hans was standing in Alabama eating turkey while Germany burned. Friedrich's face went red, and he walked away. Hans finished his cigarette alone. The camp had a library in one of the smaller buildings. Hans started going there in the evenings after work. An American guard named Sergeant Williams ran the library. He was older, maybe 40, with gray starting in his dark hair. He had brought in boxes of books, some in English and some in German. Not propaganda books, but real books. Hemingway, Steinbeck, even German authors who had been banned back home because they wrote things the Nazis did not like. One evening, Williams sat down across from Hans while Hans was reading. Williams said his father had come from Germany in 1903. He said his grandmother still lived in Munich, if she was alive, if the bombs had not gotten her. He said he knew Hans was not a monster. None of them were monsters. They were just young men who believed the wrong people, and that could happen to anyone if the liars were good enough. Hans did not know what to say to that. Williams pushed a book across the table. It was called The Grapes of Wrath. Williams said it was about poor Americans during the Depression, about people who had nothing and lost even that. He said Hans should read it. Hans took the book back to his bunk and read by the dim light they left on at night. The book was about poverty and hunger, and people being pushed off their land. It was about American suffering, but it was also about something else. These Americans could write about their own country's failures. They could print it, sell it, read it openly. In Germany, you whispered criticism in basements and hoped nobody heard. Hans read late into the night. He thought about what it meant that America was so strong it could afford to show its weaknesses. Germany had to pretend everything was perfect, even while cities burned and children starved. America could say things were bad and still be the richest, most powerful country Hans had ever seen. There was strength in that honesty that propaganda could never copy. The next morning, Hans sat in the recreation hall and wrote in a notebook he had bought at the canteen. He wrote the date, December 15th, 1944. He wrote about what he had figured out. He wrote that they lost the war not because America had more tanks or planes, though they did have more. They lost because Germany built everything on hate and lies, while America built on having so much they could afford to be practical and generous. A nation that feeds its enemy prisoners bacon for breakfast is not afraid of the future. Germany feared everything, so they destroyed everything, including themselves. He had been taught that cruelty was strength and kindness was weakness. But he could see now that cruelty was what weak people did when they were scared. Kindness was something only the strong could afford. Hans closed the notebook and looked out the window at the Alabama sky. He felt different than he had 2 months ago, lighter somehow, like he had been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. The war ended in May of 1945, but Hans did not go home right away. There were forms to fill out and processing to do and trains to organize for thousands of men who all wanted to leave at the same time. He waited through the summer in the camp that had become strange and familiar at once. The guards were friendlier now that the shooting had stopped. Some of them talked about going home themselves, back to farms in Iowa or shops in New York or whatever life they had left behind when they put on uniforms. Finally, in February of 1946, almost a year after the war ended, Hans stood in a processing line with 200 other German prisoners. They were going home. An American officer gave each man a new set of civilian clothes because their old uniforms were worn out and nobody wanted them wearing Wehrmacht gray through the streets anyway. Hans got brown trousers and a blue shirt and a jacket that was too big in the shoulders. They gave him $50 in American money, which was more cash than Hans had ever held in his life. They gave him a canvas duffel bag and told him he could fill it with whatever fit. Hans went to the canteen one last time. He bought coffee, real coffee in vacuum-sealed tins. He bought chocolate bars, a whole box of them. He bought cigarettes, carton after carton, because cigarettes were better than money in Europe now. He bought canned goods, soup and beans and fruit in heavy tins. He filled the duffel until it was so heavy he could barely lift it. Every item he put in there was something he could trade or give away or use to help whoever was left back home. On his last morning, Sergeant Williams found him outside the barracks. Williams stuck out his hand and Hans shook it. Williams said to build something better this time. He said Hans seemed like a smart guy who had figured some things out, and Germany would need smart guys who had figured things out. Hans tried to say thank you, but his English was not good enough, and his German felt wrong, so he just nodded and shook Williams' hand again, harder this time. The ship ride back across the Atlantic was nothing like the trip over. They were not crammed in holds anymore. They had cabins and meals and could walk on deck whenever they wanted. Hans spent hours standing at the rail watching the water. The ocean was gray and cold and endless. He thought about the fact that he was sailing away from the place where he had been a prisoner and toward the place where he had been free, and how strange it was that those words meant the opposite of what they should mean. America got smaller behind the ship until it disappeared into the horizon. Hans felt something twist in his chest. Not quite sadness, but close to it. He was leaving behind a country that had fed him and taught him and treated him better than his own country ever had. He was going back to a place that had lied to him about everything that mattered. But it was still home. His mother was there, if she was alive. His sister was there, if the bombs had not taken her. Home was not always the place that treated you best. Sometimes it was just the place where the people you loved were trying to survive. The ship docked in Bremen in early March. The harbor was half destroyed. Cranes stood like broken skeletons against the gray sky. Buildings along the waterfront were missing walls or roofs or entire floors. Hans walked down the gangway with his heavy duffel and looked at Germany for the first time in 3 years. It did not look like Germany. It looked like the end of the world. He caught a train heading south toward Stuttgart. The train was crowded with people who all looked thin and tired and old even when they were young. Everyone had the same haunted eyes. The train moved slowly because the tracks had been bombed and rebombed and again, and some sections were still not right. Through the window, Hans saw his country roll past. Fields that had not been planted, forests that had been cut down for firewood, villages with every third house destroyed, cities that were just rubble with paths cleared through them like trails through a forest. Stuttgart was worse than Hans had imagined, and he had imagined it would be bad. 80% of the city was gone, just gone. Where buildings used to stand, there were mountains of broken brick and twisted metal and shattered glass. Some walls still stood, but they were walls to nothing, just standing there alone with empty windows like eyes. People had cleared paths through the destruction, and along these paths, life was trying to happen. Women sold things on blankets, a dented pot here, 3 rusty nails there, a piece of soap the size of a thumb. Men with missing arms or legs sat on the rubble and stared at nothing. Children ran through the ruins playing games that involved pretending the broken world was an adventure instead of a tragedy. Hans asked directions from an old man sitting on a chunk of concrete. The old man said the street names didn't matter anymore because the streets were gone, but he pointed Hans toward the neighborhood where his family had lived. Hans walked for an hour through the ruins. Nothing looked familiar. Every landmark he remembered was destroyed. He found the spot where his house should have been by counting blocks from a church tower that was still standing, barely. His house was rubble, just a pile of brick and wood with weeds starting to grow through it. A woman was digging through the ruins of the house next door. Hans asked her about the Müller family. The woman looked up, and her face was so dirty he could not tell how old she was. She said the Müllers were alive, last she heard. They were in the refugee barracks on the west side. She pointed. Hans thanked her and started walking again. The refugee barracks had been a factory once. Now it was divided into tiny spaces with sheets and blankets, each space holding a family or what was left of a family. Hans walked through asking for Müller until someone pointed him to a corner near the back. There, in a space about 6 feet by 8 feet, he found his mother. She had aged 20 years and 3. Her hair was completely white. Her face was all lines and hollows. She was thin in a way that made her clothes hang off her like she was a coat rack. When she saw Hans, she did not believe it at first. She thought he was a ghost or a dream or a mistake. Then he said "Mama," and she made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry. And she grabbed him and held on like she was drowning and he was something solid to cling to. They sat on the floor of her tiny space, and Hans opened his duffel bag. He pulled out the coffee first, and his mother stared at the tin like it was gold. Then the chocolate. Then the cigarettes. Then the canned food. With each item, her eyes got wider and her hands started shaking. Finally, she asked where he got all this. Her voice was rough and quiet, like she had not used it much lately. Hans told her the Americans gave it to him. She looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. She said the Americans gave him things, but they were told the Americans would torture prisoners and work them to death and throw them in holes in the ground. Hans said everything they were told was a lie. Every single thing. He said he had been a prisoner in Alabama for 2 years, and he ate better there than she had eaten in 5 years. He said they gave him ice cream. They gave him turkey. They paid him to work. They taught him English. They treated him like a human being, even though he had been shooting at their friends a month before they captured him. His mother started crying then, not from happiness, but from something bigger and more complicated. She cried because if the Americans were not monsters, then maybe Germany had been wrong about everything. And if Germany was wrong about everything, then all the death and destruction and suffering had been for nothing. Hans held her while she cried and did not tell her she was right. There was no point. She would figure it out on her own, just like he had. His sister came back an hour later. She was 16 now, almost grown, but she looked 12 because hunger does that to children. She did not recognize Hans at first. When she did, she smiled, and Hans saw that she was missing a tooth. She said a brick fell on her during a bombing and knocked it out. She said it like it was a funny story, like losing teeth to falling bricks was just something that happened now. Hans gave her a chocolate bar. She held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. She did not eat it right away. She just held it and looked at it and smelled it. Hans told her to eat it, that he had more. She took one small bite and closed her eyes and made a sound that was pure joy. Hans had to look away because seeing her happiness over one bite of chocolate was breaking his heart. Over the next weeks and months, Hans used his English and his experience to get work with the Allied occupation. The Americans and British needed translators and people who understood both sides. Hans became a bridge between the conquerors and the conquered. He helped distribute food. He helped organize work details to clear rubble. He helped explain rules and answer questions and keep peace between people who had every reason to hate each other. The Marshall Plan started in 1948, and Hans saw the same pattern repeat on a massive scale. America sent food and machinery and money to rebuild the country that had tried to destroy them. Ships full of wheat and corn and powdered milk and eggs. Trucks and tractors and building supplies. Loans with low interest. Help that came with no demand for revenge or punishment. Hans watched the food arrive and thought about the bacon breakfast on his first morning as a prisoner. This was the same thing, just bigger. This was how you won a real peace. You fed people. You helped them rebuild. You showed them that cooperation worked better than conquest. Hans met a girl named Anna in 1949. She worked in the refugee office helping families find housing in the ruins. She was smart and tough and did not complain, even though she had lost her parents and 2 brothers in the war. They got married in 1950, in a ceremony held in a church that had no roof but still had walls. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Hans told them his story when they were old enough to understand. The years passed. Germany rebuilt itself, slowly and then quickly. The ruins became buildings again. The empty shops filled with goods. People stopped looking so hungry and desperate. The miracle happened, the one nobody expected, and Germany became rich and peaceful and boring, which was exactly what everyone needed it to be. In 1985, a young man with a video camera came to interview Hans for a documentary about German prisoners of war in America. Hans was 67 years old, gray-haired and comfortable, living in a small house with a garden where he grew vegetables he did not need to grow anymore. The young man asked him what it was like being a prisoner of war. Hans thought for a long time before answering. He said it was the freest he had ever been. The young man looked confused, so Hans explained. In Germany, he had been a slave to ideology. He was told what to think and who to hate and how to die. He was not allowed to question anything. But in that camp in Alabama, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, he could finally think for himself. The bacon breakfast was not just food. It was a message. It said, "You are still human. You are still worth feeding. Your leaders lied to you." Hans said he learned more about real power in that prison camp than he ever learned wearing a uniform. Real power does not need cruelty. Real strength can afford to be kind. And real freedom is not about conquering other people. Real freedom is being free from the lies that make you want to conquer in the first place. The young man asked if Hans ever regretted fighting for Germany. Hans said yes, every day. But he did not regret being captured. Being captured saved his life in more ways than one. It saved his body by taking him out of the war, But it also saved something else, something harder to name. It saved the part of him that could still see the truth when it was put in front of him on a breakfast plate. Years later, in 1992, Hans sat in his kitchen watching his grandson eat breakfast. The boy was 8 years old and healthy and took everything for granted the way children should be able to. He was eating bacon and eggs and drinking orange juice. Hans watched him and felt his eyes get wet. His grandson asked why Opa always cried when he ate bacon. Hans smiled and wiped his eyes and said, because a long time ago, bacon saved his soul. The boy did not understand, but that was okay. Maybe someday he would. Or maybe, if they were lucky, he would never need to. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.